Welcome everyone. Right on the top of the hour, we're starting with the first session of track 1. This is Design with Climate, Form Follows Performance. For those of you that are looking to get continuing education credits for your different industries, this is the learning objective and the description of the session. We will follow up with an email to link to a form to complete after you've watched all the teach-ins, so that you can help file for your continuing education credits. It's my pleasure to introduce the 2 panelists for today's session. We have Alfredo Fernandez-Gonzalez, who is a professor at the University of Las Vegas School of Architecture and the founding director of the Natural Energies Advanced Technology Laboratory, the NEAT Lab at the university. He's being joined by his colleague Pablo Roche, who is the Global Sustainable Design Leader at CallisonRTKL, Professor of Architecture and Interim Director of the Weil Center for Regenerative Studies at Cal Poly Pomona University. He also has a new book out titled Carbon Neutral Architectural Design. With that, we are very excited to hear from Alfredo and Pablo start off and talking about climate positive design. So Alfredo, I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you very much, Vince. And in this session, we're going to talk to you about some of the basic strategies for climate design, and hopefully we'll close with some Q&A. Here. So for architectural design purposes, a climate classification that addresses the challenges that we face to deliver thermal comfort is what's most needed. And as human thermal comfort depends on the dissipation of the body's metabolic heat, discomfort occurs when there is insufficient or too much heat dissipation. And when it comes to building design, we must recognize, as we are reminded by Jim Augustine, that buildings need to recognize the influence of the climate and take advantage of passive design strategies, which is really the focus of this session. Since solutions need to emerge from place, in this session, we will use a climate classification that addresses the thermal issues associated with the provision of human comfort. And for convenience, we have grouped the ANSI ASHRAE Standard 169 climates in 4 different categories: hot, humid, hot, dry, temperate, and cold. Now, using the bioclimatic chart as reference, we can see the approximate range of conditions of these different climate zones. If you're not familiar with the psychrometric chart, on the horizontal axis, we have dry bulb temperature. On the vertical axis, we have absolute humidity, and the curves, which you see inside of the chart, correspond to the relative humidity. And the temperature and humidity range found in temperate climates, this central area here, are generally associated with what we call comfortable conditions. Therefore, the boundaries, the lower and upper boundary of this zone, are really important from a design perspective. This red line that just appeared, we would call the shading line. And this line suggests that when the conditions are above it, warmer than or moving over, we need to provide shading. And the second line indicates that when the conditions go over this line, we need to provide some form of cooling. I want to quickly point out a fantastic resource, which is a climate consultant developed by Professor Murray Milne at the University of California, Los Angeles. And in this resource, you can do climate analysis for any location in the world. And here you see the 2 lines that we had just introduced before, the shading line and the wind line. Let me talk first about cold climates. And cold climates typically occur at latitudes higher than 40 degrees north or south from the equator, or at higher elevations greater than 7,000 feet or 2,100 meters above sea level. And when outdoor temperatures fall below that shading line, a well-insulated building is a prerequisite, as well as the addition of solar radiation and thermal mass. And in terms of building form, a building elongated along the east-west axis provides the best performance for winter heating, for day lighting, and also for summer sun shading. And as a general rule of thumb, the building width should be 5 times the height of the floors, floor to floor height. And if windows are available on both sides, this would allow for excellent daylight distribution and ventilation during the summertime. The length of the building can be as long as needed, as long as it's reasonable. And when a building starts to get too long, you should make that 2, 3, or more stories high. In the Northern Hemisphere, during the winter, a building elongated along the east-west axis will expose its roof and southern facade to solar radiation, so correctly placed fenestration will provide the passive solar heating that is needed. In the Southern Hemisphere, we would aim to expose the north-facing roof and facade. And during the summer, obviously, properly sized overhangs will provide adequate shading for those windows. I'd like to take this opportunity to highlight an excellent resource, the 2030 palette, which gives you all the information you need to preliminary size building components. Today, let me just quickly show you the guideline for direct gain glazing to size the glazing of a passive solar heated building. And you can see that the guideline offered is very thorough and has a lot of different information for types of climate, latitudes, and other pertinent details. When natural ventilation is being considered in a cold climate, a narrow floor plate and the addition of windows on opposite sides enhances the performance of cross ventilation as well as daylighting. To enhance the performance of cross ventilation, one of the building's long facades should be oriented as close to perpendicular to the prevailing wind direction as possible. As compromise between winter solar heating and natural ventilation, a 30-degree rotation is permitted from facing the equator. And in spaces that have an open floor plan, partition should be oriented perpendicular to the windows for better daylight penetration and also to maintain adequate airflow. I'd like to show you a case study of a net energy positive building that actually produces more energy than it consumes. These are the particulars of this building in climate zone 7B. It's located in the United States. It's an office building and has received a number of certifications, but most importantly, its building form is elongated along the east-west axis. It has a narrow floor plate, highly insulated envelope, and large south-facing windows that are necessary for passive solar heating. Here you see that the floor plan is elongated along the east-west axis, but it's also very narrow, permitting good distribution of daylight. The window-to-wall ratio of the south facade is 52% glazing, whereas the north facade is only 18%. And that narrow floor plan also allows for successful natural ventilation of the spaces. As we mentioned, proper insulation is necessary, so this building meets passive house standard requirements. It has a very tight building envelope. And to improve the lighting performance, the building features a butterfly roof that allows to have higher ceiling near the windows, south-facing windows. And in addition, to minimize glare and to control solar heat gain, the building features automated exterior sunshades. So here you see the south facade without the south-facing window sunshades deployed. And now you see it with the automated window sunshades deployed to control glare and solar gain. Thermal mass, you can see here the floor, is used both to absorb solar heat gain in the winter, but also to pre-cool the building at night during the summertime for improved comfort during work hours. And here you see the small photographs on the right illustrate a buffer zone created along the south facade so that these bookshelves that serve as partitions too help contain sort of direct solar radiation, the penetration of it, so that they don't create glare conditions in the workspaces. And the concrete slab, of course, absorbs all of the solar radiation the same way as it happens here in the lobby. And in terms of natural ventilation, as we mentioned, the narrow floor plan allows to naturally ventilate the building during the daytime. But as we mentioned, at nighttime, this building and its thermal mass allow for the night ventilation and pre-cooling of that thermal mass to maximize its use during the summer months. And this building, as we mentioned, it's a net zero energy building, but in fact it's a positive building, produces more electricity than it consumes. Now I would like to talk about hot, dry climates. And these essentially occur between the latitudes of 10 and 40 degrees north or south from the equator. And they are characterized by limited precipitation, clear skies with intense solar radiation year round, and large temperature variations between the day and the night. And when the outdoor temperature rises above this cooling line, as we described before, we have a number of strategies that may be used to cool our buildings, evaporative cooling being the main candidate, but we can also use night ventilation of the thermal mass when the nighttime temperatures fall below the comfortable zone. And in hot, dry climates, it is critical to minimize solar gains through windows, roof surfaces, and outdoor spaces. So external shading becomes a necessity, and sometimes the use of water features, evaporation, can help create comfortable conditions. In hot, dry cities and towns developed prior to the 20th century, the urban form was uniquely developed to maximize shade of walls and windows, as well as outdoor spaces. This is a photograph of Grazalema in Andalusia in Spain. And I'm going to show you a photograph of the main plaza and a very narrow street. And you can see that in the main plaza or in spaces that are more open, it's necessary to provide overhangs to fully shade those windows. You can see there are several types of shading switches available, as well as umbrellas for customers and patrons, and vegetation in the form of trees. The narrow streets remain shaded. The use of light colors also helps reflect solar radiation and reduce heat gain. And these streets therefore allow passerbys to remain comfortable. And in terms of privacy and where we can get illumination and ventilation, we use courtyards as a strategy to provide passive cooling, to also provide, as we said, some of the contact with nature and illumination for the indoor spaces. I would like to present to you a case study of a building in climate zone 3B of ASHRAE. It's a warm dry. This again is in the United States. And these are some of the particulars of the building. The L-shaped building has larger facades exposed to the south. It has a narrow floor plate, as we have described before. The use of high clear story windows for daylighting. In terms of heating, it uses strong walls and some direct gain. And in terms of cooling, it features downdraft evaporative cooling towers, which we will call cold towers. And cold towers provide direct evaporative cooling during the summer. Here's a diagram. You can see that the floor plan is elongated along the east-west axis, and the narrow floor plate allows for good distribution of daylight and appropriate ventilation of the spaces. In terms of heating, in the wintertime, trump walls and south-facing clear story windows provide the passive solar heating that is needed in the space. And appropriate shading is also a strategy used in this building to avoid overheating during swing seasons. This is a recent photograph from the spring, but you can see in these diagrams that these windows are shaded fully in the summertime and in swing seasons only partially. And in terms of cooling, when outdoor temperatures rise above comfort, the cool towers provide the necessary cooling and ventilation for the spaces. And the clear story windows and those windows in the south facade permit the exhaust of the warmer and more humid air. Evaporative cool towers take outdoor warm air and pass it through a wet medium. Then the air gains humidity, loses temperature, drops, sinks, and is delivered to the spaces, providing comfortable conditions and the necessary ventilation. Here's a photo of the construction of this building. You can see the trump wall, the high clear story windows, and the cool tower. And that's the building as it stands today. And you can see the cool towers that are used to provide both the ventilation and passive cooling of the spaces. Visitors find the cool towers fascinating and give them the type of attention often given to a large fireplace in public areas. Cool towers work really well in this project, except in the enclosed offices, so additional small fans were included. But in general terms, in open spaces, they do a really good job at cooling the building. And with that, I'm going to hand it to my colleague, Dr. Pablo Roche.
Okay, thank you, Alfredo. I'm sorry, my camera is not working. Today it's been working all day, but it's not working now, so I'll just do it without camera, but we'll see the presentation. So I'm going to continue with the hot and humid climates. As you saw in the world, they're in the tropical regions, close to the equator, low altitude, and characterized, when we look at the psychrometric chart, they're to the right and to the top of the comfort zone. And typically they're warmer and more humid than comfort. So it's necessary to keep the building from overheating and to cool it. So shade reduces heat gains, and natural ventilation evacuates the hot air from the interior. These are typically the strategies that we use in a hot and humid climate. An example of a hot and humid climate is San Juan, Puerto Rico. You can see that it's all of the dots, every dot represents 1 hour of the year. They're all towards the right and towards the top of the comfort zone. Again, shade and natural ventilation, and some are outside the natural ventilation zone, in which we're going to need some mechanical cooling. Typically, the traditional response to building in a hot and humid climate is a thin plan in which we maximize cross ventilation and we provide daylight. And the smallest facade is to the east and to the west. We're close to the equator. Sun is rising close to the east, setting close to the west. Roof is very critical. The sun is a lot of the time is high up. And then we have extensive overhangs to provide shade and reduce heat gain through the envelope. And we can see this solution in what's in vernacular architecture and traditional architecture in many parts of the world, which is really interesting. Again, coming to the same solution in a hot and humid climate. Even early 20th century responses from European companies that were exploring for oil or in tropical countries would develop similar solutions. Again, we're raising above the ground, and we're maximizing airflow, and we're providing shade. And we see this in many hot and humid climates all over the world. When we were looking at the layout of these buildings, they're also separate from each other to maximize airflow, to maximize breezes, and then there's vegetation to provide shade. Now, we can also improve these principles, and one of a solution that we developed in the office at CallisonRTKL is what we call the xylem, which is really looking at shade, looking at airflow, but then also embedding liquid-filled tubes in the soil and then cooling these below air temperature. And then the water in these tubes can cool panels that are at the bottom of the person that is close to these planters, and by the side of them, cooling by radiation. So we're looking at the physiological mechanisms through which we can achieve comfort. We're not only then looking at air movement and temperature, but we're also looking at radiant temperature. And we've explored different combinations of these xylems and how to put them together. And one of the things that's interesting also is when you combine several of them together, you can also reduce the heat island effect, and you're also maximizing comfort at the ground level. So again, just understanding these principles, we can sort of move forward, understanding how building physics affect thermal comfort. If we look at the envelope, we're looking at heat flow in a hot and humid climate. What we have to do is block heat flow by radiation, block heat flow by conduction, maximize airflow by ventilation whenever it's cooler outside than inside, and then provide some sort of radiant cooling and reducing the internal loads inside, which when we look at the building, when we look at architectural strategies, is really providing shade, providing insulation, providing cool surfaces or vegetated surfaces, and maximizing airflow. So these are the typical strategies that we would think about in a hot and humid climate. And when we think about air movement, two things are important. We have cross ventilation to remove the heat gain from the building, keeping it as close as possible to air temperature outside. And then we're also providing higher airspeed that's going to improve physiological cooling of the skin and then the sweat evaporation. And of course, this air movement can also be generated with a ceiling or portable fan. So these two things actually help in a hot and humid climate to maintain comfort. Again, getting the hot air outside the space and providing some air movement to evaporate that sweat. When we're thinking about shade, there's rules of thumb, but it's important to always understand climate. When is it cool? When is it warm outside? And we develop workflows like this one in which we use something like what Alfredo was saying, like Climate Consultant or other tools, and to understand when we need to shade and when we need to provide some solar gains. And then we look at the envelope to see the critical surfaces. We generate a solution, and then we test the solution for daylight, for glare, for energy consumption. If the solution works well, we continue with the design process. If not, we give it another try. Example of this is a small community center developed by Cal Poly students, in which you can see that it's all about having permeable walls, about air moving through the space, and then you have a roof floating above these spaces. But we can also take these ideas to larger buildings. And in this case, this is a project in Shenzhen in which we, for a competition, again, we're looking at climate. When is it hot? And then when is it cooler? And then designing the building to perform for these conditions. And the idea here is to create a courtyard at the upper levels that are going to maximize daylight and maximize air movement. We test it for daylight. We test the envelope outside for shade with different types of shade options, which is what you see at the bottom right. And then we sort of have this building that again is sort of responding to these principles, but with more density. Another project is this airport terminal in Guadalajara, which we're also working on right now, just to show you a little bit of the process. Again, we're looking at climate. We're understanding that we need shade all year. We're also finding that there's a certain time of the year from March to July that is even more critical because we have more solar radiation. So we have hot temperatures, we have more solar radiation. You get understanding what we need to do: provide shade, reduce heat flow by conduction, provide daylight, minimize glare, reduce infiltration. And then we're looking at this facade that you're seeing here is facing west. What do we do to provide transparency while blocking the afternoon sun, reducing glare and reducing heat gains? So we take a portion of the facade, which you saw. Instead of analyzing the whole facade, we look at it and we see what the baseline would be without an overhang. We're getting about 800 kilowatt hours per square meter. We put an overhang, we're reducing that by half. And then we're adding FRIT to that. We're also reducing the heat gain to the inside even more. Now, we're also looking at glare. How do we control glare? What you see here towards the top right is a person sitting looking outside. And these diagrams are showing you, just think of it as you have the hours of the day and the months of the year where you have more red. That means that during those hours, you're going to have more glare. You can see what happens when we have the canopy, we're reducing glare. We have the FRIT, we're reducing it even more. So again, just implementing strategies to reduce heat gain, to reduce glare, while still providing transparency, can generate interesting solutions. Looking at the envelope also, we did studies of all the envelope just to understand how to shade it, how to control that transparency. We found issues like this one in which we're getting more solar gain. And then we added what you see here in the bottom right is we added more solar protection, those critical areas that we found. Again, sort of looking envelope by envelope, try how to improve it and how to respond to the conditions of that specific location and orientation. In a temperate climate, the issue is really you're close to the comfort zone. Outdoors is warmer than comfort in the summer and cooler in the winter. But the interesting thing here is that neither one is very extreme. So you're you have to keep the building from overheating with shade. in the summer and, and also cool at the same time with natural ventilation. And then in the winter, you have to provide some sort of passive heating, like Alfredo was mentioning some strategies for a very cold climate. These could also work in a temperate climate, but again, it's not as critical. The thing with a temperate climate, and you can see it here, this example in LA and Los Angeles, is that you see the comfort zone in blue, and you can see that most of the time we're pretty close to the comfort zone, so we can have some passive heating in the cooler months and some natural ventilation in the warmer months, and we can provide a lot of the comfort that we need without actually using mechanical heating and cooling. We actually did this. Oh, and so the building response in a temperate climate is, again, blocking the sun in the summer, but providing some sun in the winter and natural ventilation whenever you need it. Responses, in just to show you some examples, Schindler, 1921, started with the movement of sort of like opening inside and outside. This famous sort of connection with the exterior worked really well in the summer, but not as well in the winter because there was not that much insulation. The Video Research House, the second iteration by Richard Neutra and Dion Neutra, again, natural ventilation, operable fins towards the west, and then courtyard and shade. Okay, and we did this in a project in Spain. We call it To Inhabit Device. It's really very simple. It's a beautiful climate, but it's very much a temperate climate, very close to the comfort zone. But we just the key things here is we looked at the sun and we looked at the wind. And what you see here is one diagonal element is responding to the wind, and then the east-west orientation responding to the sun. And then in the middle is, let me just show you here, this area here, there's a wind scoop that passes actually through the space from the outside to the inside. So the air passes through the building, and we can have natural ventilation summer night and summer day, but we can close the building during the winter for ventilation, but we can still provide some passive heating. There's no mechanical heating, no mechanical cooling in this building. You can see again, it's quite close to the comfort zone outside. And there's a lot of, the section is really about capturing the wind, about this wind scoop oriented to the northeast, and actually having the air passing through the space. This is the second story of the house, and you can actually stand here and you're actually under the wind scoop. And then towards the south, you have this system. Again, how do we control the shade in the summer through these sliding louvers, and then in the winter we can open them up for passive heating. Data has been collected over several years by the ITER, the Instituto Tecnológico de Energías Renovables, and then you can see that the conditions inside the house are very comfortable, very close to outside, which is actually really nice. Most of the time, again, the house is in the comfort zone. The house is rented out. You can go there and rent it, and it's actually working really nicely just by understanding when to open to the wind, when to close to the wind, when to open to the sun, and when to close to the sun. Really simple strategies. The final project I want to show is really at a mall in northern Italy, using different tools. What I wanted to show about this one is really, again, we have the climate analysis in the beginning, but we're working also with a computational design team, and we're looking at sort of the integration of the solar studies with the generation of different options and testing of these different options. So again, we're looking at climate, we're looking at temperature, solar radiation, generating a section. How is it going to work in the summer to shade from the sun? How is it going to work in the winter? And then sketches coming and going between the teams. We were working in LA and London, generating ideas. And then it's interesting here, we're looking at different orientations. So we're trying to sort of if you look at this glass surface here, how do we respond? How much radiation, how much summer we're getting the different seasons, and then what is the response that we have to do? When do we need to block more of the sun? And then when do we need to open more of the sun? And then how each of these panels, how each of the, not panels, these panes, this glass panes is going to have uh, different levels of radiation and could have different solutions depending on the orientation. And testing for the fitness based on these conditions. You know, for us as architects, they all might look good, but then we're actually testing them to see which one performs better. And then what happens if we add louvers, and then testing different louvers and testing them for different orientations and sizes of louvers and angles, again, looking at the summer and the winter. And then finally doing a simple energy model and daylight just to see if the condition is working as intended. Uh, this is developed by the same team in London. The idea is that this is in Australia, but the idea is that the space could be something like this with daylight, but controlled daylight and a rich interior life that you feel like it's outside, but with some tempering of these outdoor conditions. So just to conclude, I think Alfredo and I would sort of like to emphasize that, you know, what should we do? And it's really the first thing is to respond to climate first. I mean, whatever we do in architecture, if we want to do a carbon neutral or carbon positive building, the first step is really responding to climate. Climate responsive buildings cool and heat without generating CO2. They reduce a building's carbon footprint and are exciting because they offer design opportunities. They're about design. It's not just about adding things to a building. It's about making the building form respond to this climate around us. So thank you. I think that's, yeah, that's what I have on my side. I think we have a time for some questions.
We do. Thank you, Pablo, and thank you, Alfredo, for a wonderful presentation. We have, Alfredo, you feel free to turn back on your video. I know Pablo won't be visible, but we can go ahead and do that. One of the questions comes in about design analysis tools. There was a question of whether you were using Ladybug, which is a plugin for Rhino and Grasshopper.
Yes, we use different tools, and we use the Ladybug, we use the Climate Consultant, we use Diva, we use Sapphira. It depends on the let's say the graphic tool that we're using with. If we're using Rhino, we're using SketchUp, if we're using Revit. So, and depends also on the analysis that we're doing. For some analysis are better with some tools than others. But I think one of the nice things that we have now is the availability of all of these tools that let us do these simulations relatively quickly and with good precision. What I would emphasize always is that we need to know the building physics to see if what the results that we're getting with these tools make sense or not. So that it's not just the tools, it's really understanding the principles behind how buildings work.
Great. Thank you, Alfredo. Anything else to add to the tool conversation?
Well, as Pablo mentioned, you know, it's just developing workflows that make sense in terms of integrating the most important parameters of the climate. So if natural ventilation is a strategy that will be featured, you know, eventually moving into computer fluid dynamic software is great. If solar radiation is the main area of concern, you know, finding appropriate, you know, tools to simulate shading as well as solar gain. All in all, I think the more important thing is gaining from the beginning clear understanding from a good climate analysis of what are the main strategies and the most important parameters that have to be carefully designed by the team. You know, that's really just what it boils down to. Taking really the time to do a solid climate analysis that clearly highlights the strategies to pursue.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize that point. I agree 100% with Alfredo. I think it's you know, we sometimes we see projects in which, oh, let's do the climate analysis, and it's, you know, a little arrow in the north and, you know, a little image of the sun. the climate analysis really gives us a lot of understanding of what we can do in building design. So if we find that there's potential for natural ventilation, then we can think architecturally about what to do as a, let's say, architectural solution that's going to respond to natural ventilation. So it's the first important step in this process.
Great, thank you both. We had another question that came in asking about costs. Is costs also considered when optimizing the form and material selection? How does that play into the decision making?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I didn't because I went very quickly through it. But when the computational design team had several, they were comparing the options for four things, and one of them was cost. So absolutely.
And I think I would just add to that, that oftentimes there's a misconception that, you know, a net zero building or a building that, you know, it's optimized through the design process could be more expensive, but the reality is that it's not always the case. In fact, not necessarily. So it's important to consider these strategies early on because you also reduce the capacity and the size of any backup equipment that may still need to be added to the project. So again, it's important to take a look at cost, but to recognize also that you know, a climate attuned building is not necessarily going to be more expensive than traditional building.
Great, so preventative measures like the shading devices or louvers will balance out to the cost savings you might experience from mechanical systems.
Absolutely, yep.
We had another question coming up about considering performance benchmarks for a global portfolio. How would you consider that?
I'm not sure. Well, we all what the question is about is that all it says, Vincent?
Pablo, maybe more about, you know, how do you understand the typical use patterns in the different climates around the world? Are there tools or databases? Might be my guess.
Typical use patterns?
Like end uses, energy use expectations.
I would say, look, at the beginning of the design process, the most important thing is to aim or identify clearly what is the reduction target that the design team wishes to pursue. So every country has, you know, an energy code. And so if you aim for a percentage reduction below the code that is used in your region or in your country, that's, I think, a discussion that needs to happen early on, because then all of your simulations and workflows are going towards validating that initial design intent. But I would say at this point in time, and with the urgency that exists at the present moment, most projects should be designed to be net zero ready if they don't feature renewables, but certainly aim to reduce the consumption of energy to the maximum extent, and to begin to consider that, you know, with the subsequent addition of renewable energy, they could become net zero. I mean, net zero really needs to be the goal and target.
Excellent, Alfredo. Wonderful answer. I think we have time for one final question. We'll have to have a short response, though, to wrap the session up. Question is, what about microclimates of the area? Most of the time we're designing to the macroclimate of the region. Can you describe a little bit of that?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really important point. We spend a lot of time actually finding the right weather file. Let's put it that way. It's and sometimes we cannot find it, and we generate it, or we have somebody generate it for us based on satellite data. So it's very important when we do these analysis to have the most precise possible weather file. Otherwise, you know, everything will be wrong, right, from that starting point. So it's very important. In one project, one of the things that I think we're going to, that I really want to do, and we haven't, I confess we haven't done it yet, is really, as soon as we start a project, is really put a portable weather station on site and actually start getting weather data, even if it's just for a year, just to sort of compare that weather file with the weather file that we're using.
And if I could just quickly add, and also to recognize that many activities can happen outdoors, so to maximize the use of outdoor spaces through some of the techniques and examples shown in this lecture, and Pablo showed fantastic examples done by, his firm. So I would say pay attention to maximizing the use of outdoor spaces, and in doing that, creating microclimates that are conducive to thermal comfort.
Thank you both. There's some more great questions coming in, but unfortunately we've run out of time. So what we have agreed to do with the presenters is to take all the Q&As and send them to them via email, and they'll write written responses. And then we'll post those written responses on the CarbonPositive website. So don't worry, your questions will be answered, and they are really great questions coming through. So Pablo and Alfredo, we will follow up. I would just like to thank you again for presenting on this topic. Not only have you done it for this region, but for the other 2 regions as well of the teaching. So we greatly appreciate your dedication to the mission and your wonderful work. So thank you so much for joining us for this presentation.
It's our pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
For the attendees, this is the conclusion of this session. If you go back to the CarbonPositive agenda website, or the site where you access this link from, if you're in China, then you can see the next session links and go on to the next session, which will start in about 4 minutes. So thank you again, Pablo and Alfredo.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.